Good evening. Welcome to the Lawrence County Museum. We're so glad that you're here. My name is Connie Post, and I'm the administrator here. And I just want to tell you about a few things that we have coming up, and then we're going to turn this over to Durant. Wanted to let you know that this Thursday night, Genealogy will be meeting at 7 o'clock. They're going to be doing a show and tell. Bring something that you want to share about your genealogy research and things that you've done. On Saturday at 11 o'clock, we will be cutting the ribbon for our Black History exhibit, which is called The Road to Education for Black Americans, and Dr. Lily Beasley Glover will be speaking. On next Tuesday, the 18th, Dr. Kendra Hamilton from Presbyterian College will be here sharing about her book and her study on the Gullah people, and it's going to be really fascinating, so we hope you'll join us. And on Sunday, the 23rd at 3 o'clock, we're going to have a singing here with Smyrna AME Church and Laurel Hill Baptist Church, and Harold Ligon is going to be here doing some of the, Elma, common meter, traditional common meter hymns, Negro spirituals, slavery hymns, and that type of thing. And then on March 6th, now this is a change of date, Durant will be here on March 6th, which is a Thursday, not a Tuesday. Next month is Women's History Month, and he's going to be talking about the role of women in the American Revolution. Yes. So I'm going to turn this over to him tonight, and he's going to be talking about Black Americans in the American Revolution. All right, Durant, you know what to do?
Okay. Thank you, Connie. I appreciate that. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, thank you. So tonight I want to start by saying that I'm a proud American, but I believe in discussing American history, we do need to discuss it warts and all. And there are some warts that we are going to be talking about tonight. There's some glorious events and occurrences, and there's some that aren't so glorious. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started, and I'd like to show you the second most famous picture in the American, or painting in the American Revolution, and it happens to be my favorite painting in the American Revolution. So what this is a scene from Cowpens, from the very end of the fight at Cowpens, when Banastre Tarleton has lost, and he's being chased from the field, and he's being chased by none other than William Washington, George Washington's second cousin, once removed. So there's a furious sword fight, one of the most famous sword fights in the American Revolution, and this happened just 30 miles from here. So here you see Banastre Tarleton breaking William Washington's sword at the hilt, as Cornet Patterson is raising his sword to chop off the head of William Washington. When a waiter, too small to wield a sword, this fellow here, fires his pistol and wounds Cornet Patterson, thus saving William Washington's life. These two individuals, William Washington and Colin, fought right here in Lawrence County 18 days before this battle. They fought at the Battle of Hammond's Old Store. Colin is described 3 different times by 3 different writers. And he is described at Hammond's Old Store as being a boy of 14 with puny arms. Too small to wield a sword. Cornet Patterson describes him as well, and he describes him as an ordinary trumpeter. So that's Colin's role. Here's his trumpet. What is a young waiter with puny arms doing riding at William Washington's side? He is the trumpeter, and his most important role is giving the commands by bugle for William Washington and his cavalry to operate. So those 2 individuals fought right here. With those 3 descriptions of Colin, no one mentions his race. So we don't know. There are other paintings of this same scene, and they all show Colin as being white. So don't know exactly, whether he's black or white, but Colin was a hero no matter what he was, and being described as a waiter, that usually is definition of a manservant or something like that. This is the most famous painting of the American Revolution. This is Washington crossing the Delaware, and there is a black American in this painting. But it's very hard to see. This is Prince Whipple, who was a slave belonging to Colonel William Whipple. And this is my least favorite painting of the American Revolution. It's a dramatic scene. Francis Marion is negotiating with a British officer and invites him to supper. And what the officer is served is sweet potatoes on a plate of pine bark. And the British officer goes back to his commanders and he says, "We can't fight these men. They are living on sweet potatoes, served on pine bark." Well, that's all well and good, but I just can't stand this depiction right here of Oscar or Buddy. This is Francis Marion's manservant. The generals in the state of South Carolina, and we had the best ones in the nation, Pickens, Marion, and Sumter. All of these colonels had manservants who were by their side the entire war. Thomas Sumter had Soldier Tom, who was 6'5" and 260. Thomas Sumter's wife was an invalid. She couldn't walk. Soldier Tom could pick her up and put her on the horse. That was just one of his many attributes. Again, he fought side by side. Andrew Pickens had Dick, who was his constant companion. It was never a good time to be a slave in South Carolina. During the American Revolution, it was the worst time of all, because you never knew when the homestead or plantation or whatever it was going to be overrun. And when a homestead or plantation is overrun, the object is to gather plunder to get the riches, and the most valuable properties of all were the enslaved people. So they would be snatched away. You did not want your owner to be captured or overrun, because then you were the property of whoever captured you, never knowing what your fate would be again, never seeing your family again. Slaves were objects of plunder during the American Revolution. It's not all bad news, though. This is Thomas Carney. He was a free black, born to free black parents. And he enlisted 3 different times. He was from Maryland. And he fought with George Washington in the Philadelphia campaigns, Brandywine, White Plains, Germantown. He served the term of his enlistment. He joined the militia, the Maryland militia, for a while. And then he joined the 1st Maryland Regiment, which was the #1 regiment in the United States. That was the best regiment in the Continental Army, the 1st Maryland Regiment. And Thomas Carney was in the thick of that throughout the entire time. So Thomas Carney was particularly heroic at 96, 30 miles away from here. He was fighting in Nathaniel Greene's army. And Nathaniel Greene had besieged the British fortress at 96. This is the Star Fort, virtually impregnable. You see the 8 points of the star. You could not attack that fort without being shot at from 2 sides, one of those sides being your backside. So it was formidable. This is the town of 96. It was fortified. and then the Star Fort. And Nathaniel Greene totally surrounded this fort and started siege works going towards the fort under the command of a Polish nobleman named Thaddeus Kosciuszko. So the parallels, the traverses, second parallel, third parallel, they got this close, so close that they could throw hand grenades at each other. Secretly, back in the woods, Kosciuszko had his men prefabricate a pine log tower 30 feet tall. It's called a Mayan tower. So you can get up above and shoot down on the defenders of the fort. Also, Kosciuszko had a tunnel or a mine going into the fort. So they were pretty determined to take this fort through a various number of means. However, down in Charleston, Lord Rawdon, with the reserves, was gathering up an army of 2,000 men. And he was marching towards 96. And Greene knew this. He had his scouts checking him out and realized that it was just going to be a very short time before Rawdon was able to relieve the siege at 96. Nathaniel Greene had one day to crack this nut, or he was going to have to retreat and go back home. So as a final movement to take this fort, Nathaniel Greene ordered what has been known throughout history as the Forlorn Hope. And he asked for 50 volunteers of the 1st Maryland Regiment, the best of the best, and Thomas Kearny was one of those volunteers. And they attacked the fort. And as they were attacking, the British sent out 2 parties from the Sally Port here in the back. And they came around, and now they're attacking the attackers on the flank. And this is the scene of this attack of the Forlorn Hope at 96. Can you imagine going into that carnage? This perfectly describes what a terrific struggle this was, life or death. In this battle, in this attack, Thomas Kearny's captain, Perry Benson, gets seriously wounded. And Thomas Kearny picks him up, puts him on his back, and takes him to safety behind the lines, being shot at the whole time. And this is one of the most heroic acts that we recognize Thomas Kearny for. He was a corporal in the 1st Maryland Regiment. But Thomas Kearny was not the only black American at the Siege of 96. Now, another individual who was important there is Agrippa Hull. And this is a painting of Agrippa Hull when he is in his 80s. He was quite a talented individual. I mentioned Thaddeus Kosciuszko, who was the Polish nobleman engineer. Kosciuszko designed West Point. He helped Greene in the race to the Dan, where he operated brilliantly. At Kosciuszko's side the entire time, sometimes referred to as his orderly or his assistant, he was an enlisted man. But at his side the whole time was Agrippa Hull. Now, Kosciuszko was an abolitionist during this time. He was a wealthy nobleman from Poland, and he pledged his fortune in his will to buying enslaved persons and freeing them. It turns out that was illegal for him to do that, so that never happened. And his distant relatives in Poland got his money. But Agrippa Hull was beside Kosciuszko the whole time that these siege works were underway. And he was a very talented individual. Later on, he joined the medical corps, and he was trained to do operations and amputations. After the war, he moved to his hometown in New York. Can't remember the name right now, but he became a very wealthy landowner in New York. So at the beginning of the American Revolution, there were 105,000 black Americans in South Carolina. There were 70,000 men or people of European descent in South Carolina. Of those 105,000 black Americans, 100,000 of them lived along the coast where the rice plantations were. These were massive plantations. If you see what's outlined in white here, these are the tidal basins that's so conducive to growing rice. And that's where these plantations were, with 400 slaves at a time. Of the 70,000 Europeans who were here, 35,000 of them were in the low country, and 35,000 of them were in the back country, where we are now. And there were 5,000 black Americans, enslaved persons, in the back country of South Carolina when the Revolutionary War took place. And a little while later, we'll talk about some of the importance of that. You cannot talk about black Americans in the Revolution, particularly in South Carolina, particularly here in Lawrence County, and particularly here in the city of Lawrence. You can't talk about that without talking about Henry Lawrence. And Henry Lawrence was the largest slave trader in America. He sold 8,000 people on the docks of Charleston Harbor. And he became very wealthy. He had his plantations, and he had 400 slaves on his plantations. So, you know, one of the leading slave owners and propagators, progenitors, he was a very capable man. He was the chairman of the Council of Safety. The Council of Safety was started early on during the war. They had martial law powers. They had dictatorial powers. They ran the state of South Carolina very efficiently for the war that was raging around them. And Henry Lawrence was the second president of the Continental Congress. So he was in Philadelphia in 77 and 78. He was there when George Washington was at Valley Forge. So he was a very influential man. He was a very apt administrator. There is evidence that later in life he had a change of heart with his attitudes toward slavery in America. He did get out of the slave trading business. And while he was second president of the Continental Congress, he was approached by his son, John Lawrence. Now, John Lawrence was the most avid abolitionist in South Carolina, the son of the leading slave trader. But they started seeing a little bit more eye to eye as the war and time progressed. John Lawrence realized that there was a manpower problem with the Patriot forces. I mean, everybody always wanted more men in their army, more soldiers. So John Lawrence came up with a proposal that the Continental Congress would raise a regiment of 3,000 enslaved persons. Once they served out their enlistment time, they would be freed. And he convinced his father to get that bill passed through the Congress in Philadelphia. And that was done with one stipulation, that it had to be voted on and approved by the state delegation as well. And the state of South Carolina refused to have an additional 3,000 armed black former slaves in the state. So that idea of John Laurens was nixed. Lawrence County, Georgia is named after John Laurens. He was quite a noted individual in his own right. But the power of the lack of manpower was a real issue. And in 1780, Thomas Sumter came up with a plan to alleviate manpower shortage. He was a militia general. When you're in the militia, you get called up. You get called up for 60 days, and you have to serve for 60 days. But you don't have to serve for 61 days. So these militia leaders, Marion, Sumter, and Pickens, had significant problems with their men, their manpower just up and leaving. So Thomas Sumter wanted to have a program whereby troops would sign up with him, state troops, for a 10-month enlistment. And he could really make a lot of progress if he knew he had the same men for 10 months all the way through. But the problem was, how do you pay these men? Because everybody was broke. And the way he proposed to pay his men was through plundering the riches of the Loyalist plantations. Plundering. And he would divide the plunder among his men. Now, when you do have a law like that, that does mean that you attract the worst sorts of men to join your ranks. But the payment plan that Thomas Sumter came up with is this. This is called Sumter's Law. If you signed up with him for a 10-month period and you were a private, you were paid 1 slave. If you were a sergeant, you were paid 1.5 slaves. If you were a captain, you'd get 2.5 slaves. And a half slave was defined as a slave under the age of 10 or over the age of 45. Now, this entire plundering system got way out of hand, and the governor, John Rutledge, told Sumter, said, this just isn't working, because it was engendering so much hate among those who were plundered that it was counterproductive. And when John Rutledge told Thomas Sumter to knock off the plundering, at that point, Thomas Sumter quit. That was towards the end of the war, when the war was about over. And towards the end of the war, when the war was about over. And the British were pushed back and back and back into the surrounds of Charleston. They came up with a plan of theirs, which they felt like would really weaken the Patriot forces. They promised any enslaved person who came into their lines would have their freedom. And it was a momentous, arduous journey to get from Patriot-held territory into the British lines. You faced all kinds of trials and tribulations along the way. But you also did that knowing that you were leaving your family behind and you would never see your family again. That was a heavy load to carry. 5,000 of the enslaved persons in South Carolina took the British up on that deal. And they went into British lines. They were free, they weren't owned, they weren't chattel property. They were put to task defending, building up the defenses of Charleston. They did, go to work, but they were in the British refugees, as so many refugees in Charleston were at that time. So that brings us to a fellow I would like to talk about, and this is a fellow named Willie O'Ree. Willie O'Ree is still living. He's 90 years old. But what does a black hockey player have to do with all this? Willie O'Ree was the first black hockey player in Canada in the NHL, and he was the first black hockey player to join the NHL Hall of Fame. And Lewis Henry Gates took an interest in Willie O'Ree. He does that show on PBS, Finding Your Roots. And his producers were able to trace Willie O'Ree's family back 3 generations to his great-great-grandfather. And his great-great-grandfather was named Paris. And they found Paris O'Ree in a book called The Book of Negroes, which was recorded in 1783 when 3,000 of the formerly enslaved persons were now in Charleston. Started out with 5,000, but 3,000 of them were sent to Canada, where they and their names were recorded in the Book of Negroes. The remaining 2,000 were sent to the Caribbean, where they were sold back into slavery by corrupt British officials. So in the Book of Negroes, Lewis Henry Gates' producers found this quote: Paris, 19, stout lad, formerly the property of Colonel O'Ree, Charlestown, South Carolina. Left him 4 years ago at the age of 15. Left him 4 years ago and joined the British troops. At the age of 15, Paris O'Ree left his family behind and walked into the British lines, where he stayed for 4 years until he wound up in Canada in 1783. So the producers, they were excited to have this reference to Paris, who was the property of Colonel O'Ree. Let's go check that out. Except that there is no Colonel O'Ree in the American Revolution. But all South Carolinians know this name. We know this name as the county where Myrtle Beach is, Horry County. Horry County. It was Colonel O'Ree that was the owner of 19-year-old Paris. So then they started looking at the O'Ree family records, and they found numerous wills. And in these wills, it lists the family of Paris, Dublin, and his wife Bess, and Paris, and Harriet, and Harry, and Lucy. This is Willie O'Ree's family from the rice fields of South Carolina. Up here is where Colonel O'Ree's plantation was, the Waccamaw Neck. And this is where Henry or Willie O'Ree's family is from. So I do want to close with that. I'd love to get questions and comments. But I want to let you know that I'm not here talking tonight in honor of Willie O'Ree, because he's got as many honors as anybody could possibly have. But what I would like to honor tonight is Dublin and Bess and Harriet and Harry and Lucy, the family of Willie O'Ree. Willie O'Ree was able to find his family, and it's a blessing that he was able to. So that's my discussion for this evening. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
They can't hear you. All right. If you have a question, I need you to speak into the microphone.
How did the British inform the enslaved of their proposal to set them free?
South Carolina flipped 3 times. There were Patriot and Loyalist forces back and forth and back and forth. And when it was a period of time that was occupied by Loyalist forces, that's when the word would be getting out. There were raids into, enemy territory, and this is the kind of situation where that word would be passed out. Now, the enslaved people in the backcountry, I doubt any of them took up the British on that officer. They would have had to cross 100 miles of hostile territory to do that. But I would say it was primarily the local African Americans who were the ones who were spreading the word.
Okay, so the British would accept males that could fight. Like if a family with females and children escaped to Charleston, would the British accept them as well?
I believe they would.
Okay.
I believe they would. There was one black regiment in the Continental Army, and this is from Rhode Island, the Rhode Island 1st. And in Rhode Island, they passed a law that said that if an enslaved person joined the Rhode Island Continental Line, that they would be free as soon as they passed muster. So this means that they had to be, physically fit. Any enslaved person who was physically fit, once you pass muster, you're accepted into the Continental Line, you are free. Now, you had to live up to the terms of your enlistment, but the owner of that enslaved person was then paid the enlistment bonus. Plus, he was paid half his pay throughout the entire time. And the owner was also paid market value. So, in a way, the owners were definitely paid when their enslaved people went into the Army. There were 88 black Americans who took the Rhode Islanders up on that. And one of the reasons the number is so low is because there were very few slaves in Rhode Island.
There were blacks. There were a high number of free blacks.
Yes, there were, free blacks as well. And the 1st Rhode Island Regiment consisted of these formerly enslaved and free black as well. There were no enslaved persons that were given their freedom in any of the southern states. That just did not happen.
The British never really had a formal universal policy. It was mostly up to the local commander. They could be accepted into the lines, and if they were stout and motivated, they could turn them into a soldier, but more likely they would be pick and shovel work or drummers or musicians, fifers, if they were too young to fight.
That is true.
But it was pretty much local commanders' decision. They were a significant number that were enlisted in the Hessian regiments.
Which is surprising.
I sent you the documentation on that.
Yes.
So what happened to John Lawrence if he was an abolitionist?
John Lawrence is it's a complicated case. Because of his father being the president of the Continental Congress, he was given the position of an aide to George Washington, aide de camp. Very important, prestigious role, and Hamilton and Lafayette, all of these famous aides de camp of Washington. John Laurens was there too. After Henry Laurens was the president of the Continental Congress, he was sent to the Netherlands to negotiate a treaty, get a loan, get money, and that sort of thing. And his ship was captured at sea. And now Henry Laurens was thrown into the Tower of London, where he stayed for the rest of the war. So after that, we still needed to go over to Holland and get those silver levers, and John Laurens was sent in lieu of his father. And John Laurens, at the age of 24, went to Holland, came back with 2.5 million silver levers, however much money that is. So he played important roles. He was also very active in the battles that he fought in. He was so active, he got wounded in 4 of these battles. He was reckless. And at the very end of the war, 1782, when the British are holed up in Charleston, the noose is tightening and tightening around them, but there's not a lot of activity going on. But there is a foraging party that goes out, and they run into each other. And the British fortify themselves behind the breastworks. And one of the last casualties of the American Revolution was John Laurens, because he rushed that breastworks. And he was killed in the Battle of Combahee. And many surmise that he had a death wish, is why he got wounded so many times. So that was the end of John Laurens. Hand him the mic.
Can I ask?
Hand him the mic.
I heard you mention something about Fort Lawn. I was just wondering, I know out in Chester, South Carolina, when you're coming back, when I'm coming back from Carol Winds, I see Fort Lawn. I was just wondering, was that related to something with the what you were speaking on?
Well, Fort Lawn was a British fortification, and it's one of the most pristine fortifications that has survived the Revolutionary War. And in that area, definitely, enslaved persons who had come into the British line, they would have been at Fort Lawn as well.
So that was in Chester County, South Carolina?
Fort Lawn is closer to Berkeley County, is what I was describing. As far as another fort with a name similar to that, I'm not really aware of that.
There is a town in that area called Fort Lawn.
Okay, yes.
It's not a fort, it's a town.
Okay.
L-A-W-N.
Yeah, lawn, like a yard, yeah, lawn.
How long did the rice plantations last after the Revolutionary War? How long did that go on?
They became less and less useful, popular after the cotton gin was invented, and production switched over to cotton. Plus, there were other places in the world that it was more economical to grow rice than it was on the South Carolina coast. So it's kind of a combination of events in that regard. Back here.
I just want to make 2 comments. I think one, a lot of people know John Laurens from Hamilton. I mean, he's one of the main characters in that, and they talk about his death in the play, and his wish to raise a black regiment. But the thing I always find interesting is about the rice plantations is if you can go on Google Maps tonight, and if you look down in the Ace Basin, you can still see the lines of where the irrigation and everything was. I mean, it's the fact that that's still on a map today, that you can see where the plantations were, is always amazing to me.
It's amazing to me too, and we can trace Revolutionary War battles and events from seeing the vestiges of the rice fields, the rice paddies, and the causeways that were utilized in getting from one rice field to the other. So those landforms really have not changed. When you go to Brook Green Gardens and you look in the back, you can see those marshes though totally laid out in squares. I mean, those are their old rice plantations. Yes. What?
The rice plantations on the coast of the South Carolina were established primarily to feed the slaves in the West Indies growing sugarcane. They didn't want it, the growers of the sugarcane didn't want to take sugarcane land out of production because they could make more money with the sugarcane land. So they said, let's try to find someplace else to grow the rice. And that's primarily the reason that the coast of South Carolina was established.
That's why Charleston was founded in the first place in 1670. Not Bermuda, that other B island was Barbados. Thank you very much. Barbados is 1/4 the size of Lawrence County. And it was one of the best places in the world to grow sugarcane, which is one of the worst crops to grow for any individual. But it was so important to have Barbados 100% covered in sugarcane that they didn't even have room to grow vegetables. And that's why 1,500 miles away from Barbados, the Charlestown Landing and Charlestown Colony was founded to grow vegetables for Barbados. So that's part of it. Do you have a question?
Durant, I wanted to ask you, not all Americans supported the Revolutionary War. America was very divided at
Yes.
that particular time. How did they resolve that in the South? Because there were certain plantation owners who very much supported the British, and there were others who supported
Well, the way it was resolved was through the Confiscation Act of 1778. If you were a British supporter, if you did take up arms for the British side, you had 60 days to sell your property, and whether you sold it or not, you had to leave. So many of the Loyalists were driven out. Many of the Loyalists were uncommitted, and they would sign oaths of allegiance to keep their property from getting confiscated. But several of these Loyalists who did have their properties confiscated were allowed to reapply for citizenship. And if they weren't considered to be an obnoxious person, then they could retain, their citizenship. The leading citizen of Lawrence County did this. This is Patrick Cunningham. Excuse me. The wealthiest individual in Lawrence County was Patrick Cunningham, a Loyalist colonel. He had 40 enslaved people down at Rosemont Plantation. So about 10 or 12 years after the war, he was readmitted back into his holdings. He was immersed. He was fined 12% of his holdings, but he came back. And talking about the resolution, the healing, if you will, I think there's no better example of the healing of America after the Revolutionary War than when you think of Patrick Cunningham's granddaughter, the granddaughter of a loyalist colonel and the grandniece of the loyalist general, who is Robert Cunningham. That granddaughter is Anne Pamela Cunningham, and she is responsible for saving George Washington's home, Mount Vernon. Granddaughter of a loyalist colonel saved Mount Vernon. And to me, that's coming full circle and shows, unity during that particular time. Didn't last. The people that are listening in can't hear you.
I would never want you to defend the movie and the inaccuracies in The Patriot, but I was wondering, when Tarleton comes up to the plantation, after the battle, and he says, okay, we're freeing you guys. And they say, oh, we're already free, which I know they weren't, but they said, oh, we're already free, we worked this land. And he says, well, good, now you're free to fight for the British. Did they do that? Did they, instead of taking as plunder, did they take as soldiers?
Well, first of all, I love The Patriot. And it's ironic that you mentioned that, because about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I kind of did a podcast with 2 other guys who didn't love The Patriot, and we kind of had a nice back and forth. What I think about The Patriot is I think it totally depicts the spirit of the times, even though the historical events weren't intended to be accurate. But I will say this, the greatest inaccuracies that I see in The Patriot is how they deal with the role of Black Americans in the American Revolution. So for one, you have that one soldier in the South Carolina line that is, fighting for a year for his freedom, but that never would have happened. And it showed that heartwarming scene with all the Black Americans down on the coast. After the plantation had been burned, they go down to the coast to settle and hide away, there in peace. The instant either one of those armies on either side realized that there was a settlement of blacks on the coast, it's too valuable not to take up. Too valuable. They would have been captured and sold as slaves. There was a free black, well, not free, but there was a camp like that on Sullivan's Island before the British came down and we had the Battle of Sullivan's Island. And this was early on, 1775, 1776. There were 500 escaped enslaved persons on Sullivan's Island, waiting for the British to come so they could go into the British lines. But the British got defeated, they never came. That camp was attacked. And it was attacked by William Moultrie and Francis Marion. And I'm not sure what happened to the rest of them.
So did the British lines forcibly conscript enslaved people?
They just did not want them working for the Patriots. They could have sold them back into the Caribbean. But whatever it took to cripple the Patriot economy by not allowing them to have slaves, they weren't going to allow them to have slaves. There was one huge loyalist plunderer named Alexander Maxwell who had a fort at Fort Granby. And Andrew Maxwell had been plundering incredible. He had a fortune, cattle, hogs, 300 slaves. All of this at Fort Granby, which is where Casey is near Columbia. Well, that was prime target for Thomas Sumter because that's how he paid his men. Andrew Maxwell had 300 slaves that he had captured as plunder while he was plundering. So Thomas Sumter wanted those slaves, and he attacked Fort Granby twice, very unsuccessfully, because Sumter wasn't the best tactician that there was. Fort Granby did fall when Light Horse Harry Lee came on the scene after Sumter had left. And Light Horse Harry Lee sends a message to Andrew Maxwell and says, look, you can load up 2 wagons of whatever you want, gold, silver, you name it. You can load up 2 wagons and you can drive away, and we will not bother you. And Andrew Maxwell took him up on that offer. And Light Horse Harry Lee was able to take Fort Granby in 2 hours that Sumter couldn't take in 2 months. And so when that happened, Sumter was furious because he wanted those slaves. And Light Horse Harry Lee said, sure, take it. And Nathaniel Green probably is the one that worked this out. But Sumter wound up with all of the booty at Fort Granby.
Unlike the North, the concept of a free black man didn't really exist in the South.
There were a few.
If you were black and not owned by someone, that just meant you were up for grabs.
To a degree, there were a few free blacks who were businessmen and things like that.
States, northern colonies, there was a recognition of that condition, being a free black man.
True. That's true. Well, I appreciate the discussion this evening. Thank you for your attention, and I appreciate that. And we'll call it an evening. Thank you very much. Okay. Eugene, it's nice to see you. I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure who that was piping up back in the back. Glad you made it.